Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Lost Colony of Roanoke. Welcome to a journey back in time, to the shores of an island bathed in mystery and moonlight. In this sleepy time story, we will explore the tale of the Lost Colony of Roanoke, an enduring legend from centuries past. The tone of our journey is cozy and calm, with a touch of mystery as we wander through history's shadows at a gentle, relaxing pace. Snuggle in, close your eyes, and imagine the scene. A warm summer evening on the coast of what is now North Carolina. The year long ago in the late 1500s. A soft breeze whispers through the pine trees and salt marsh grasses. Overhead, countless stars glimmer in the velvet sky, just as they did for the colonists of Roanoke so many nights ago. Tonight, we'll trip through the entire saga of Roanoke Island, from the hopeful beginnings of England's first attempt to plant a colony in the New World, to the eerie discovery that gave Roanoke its nickname, the Lost Colony. We'll meet key figures like Sir Walter Raleigh, John White, Queen Elizabeth I, and others, hearing their dreams and struggles in a calm and friendly voice. We'll walk through the events step by step, each expedition and each challenge, all at a leisurely pace designed to help you relax. As we meander down the path of history, we'll pause often for gentle reflections, letting the richness of the story wash over us like the soft lap of waves on the shore. Importantly, we'll also explore the many theories that have arisen over the years about what happened to the Roanoke colonists after they vanished. Some theories are rooted in historical evidence in archaeology, while others wander into the realm of legend and supernatural. We'll discuss assimilation with local native tribes, possible relocation to new areas, disease or famine, conflicts or attacks, and even fanciful supernatural ideas. Throughout our tale, you'll hear descriptions of gentle coastal landscapes, dense forests, flickering campfires, and quiet starry nights. These sensory details are here to create a soothing atmosphere. Perhaps you'll imagine yourself walking beside the colonists on a sandy beach at dusk, or listening to the nighttime sounds of the wilderness as they might have. Our pacing will remain calm and measured, with natural pauses to allow your mind to grow heavy. So let's begin our journey. Take a slow, deep breath and let it out softly. Feel the weight of history as a comfortable blanket around you. We're setting sail now to the age of exploration, where a brave new dream was taking shape. The dream of a colony at Roanoke. In the late 1500s, England was a land of restless ambition and maritime daring. Queen Elizabeth I sat on the throne, a clever and determined monarch in a time of fierce rivalry with Spain. The air at court was filled with talk of discovery and the wealth of the Americas. England was a bit late to the game of New World exploration, watching Spain grow rich from its colonies. But a vision was forming among Elizabeth's advisors and adventurers. England, too, should have a foothold in this new world across the ocean. It wasn't just about riches. It was also about national pride, strategic advantage, and spreading England's influence. It was in this atmosphere Sir Walter Raleigh, one of the Queen's favorites, stepped forward with a bold idea. Sir Walter Raleigh was a charismatic gentleman, an explorer at heart, with a knack for catching the Queen's imagination. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth I granted Raleigh a royal charter, empowering him to explore and colonize lands in North America not already claimed by Christian monarchs. Raleigh's mission was clear: establish an English settlement in the vast and largely unknown territories, and perhaps even use it as a base to harry the Spanish treasure ships that had sailed the nearby seas. The Queen's charter gave Raleigh broad authority to, quote, discover, search, find out, and view such remote heathens and barbarous lands, unquote, and hold on to them in the name of England. However, one condition loomed. Raleigh had to establish a colony by 1591, or the charter would expire. The clock was ticking on his grand endeavor. Raleigh himself, bound by the Queen's command to remain at court, would not sail to America. Instead, he became the planner and financier, delegating the voyages to trusted associates. Imagine him in 1584, a thoughtful figure in a velvet doublet, pacing under the tapestry of a royal chamber, dreaming of afar-off shores. He likely imagined gentle harbors and fruitful lands across the sea where English life could take root. Elizabeth I was enthusiastic too. When Raleigh described the Promised Land, she fancifully named it Virginia, in honor of herself, the Virgin Queen. And so, with Queen Elizabeth's blessing and Raleigh's determination, preparations began for England's first serious attempt to plant a colony in North America. In these early moments of our tale, everything was hopeful possibility. Picture the bustle of 16th century docks at Plymouth, England. Wooden ships creak as they bop in the harbor. Sailors load barrels of provisions, coils of rope, and chests of trade goods. The salty air mixes with the scent of pine tar on the hulls. Raleigh has outfitted 2 small ships to sail westward. He's not sending colonists just yet. First will come a reconnaissance mission to scout the best location. The year is 1584, and 2 captains, Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, have been chosen to lead this exploration voyage. Along with them is an experienced Portuguese pilot, Simon Fernandez, to navigate the tricky waters. Some historians believe that also on board, quietly taking notes, may have been a brilliant scientist named Thomas Harriot, and a talented artist-cartographer named John White, though records aren't entirely certain if they went on this first trip. Regardless, the little expedition sails southward from England, catching the trade winds to carry them across the vast ocean. Can you hear the gentle lapping of waves against wooden hulls as the ship slipped out to sea? The journey took several weeks, but in July 1584, Amadas and Barlow's ships sighted the low coastline of what we now call the Outer Banks of North Carolina. On July 13th, 1584, they made landfall, finding a lovely inlet in calm waters behind barrier islands. They had arrived in the land of the Carolina Algonquin peoples. Before them lay a region of sandy islands, dense woods, and broad sounds that looked like a paradise of plenty. Stepping ashore, the English found the local inhabitants to be curious and mostly welcoming. The native people they encountered were part of an Algonquin-speaking nation. On Roanoke Island in the nearby mainland, the tribe was known as the Secatan. The Secatan were ruled by a chief named Wengina, though he was injured at the time, so his brother, Granganimio, initially met the newcomers as an ambassador. With patience and friendliness, Granganimio exchanged gifts with the English. Imagine this first meeting, the summer heat shimmering off the water, an English captain in his light armor bowing, and Granganimio offering smoking pipes of tobacco or fresh fish. Though from entirely different worlds, they found a tentative understanding. It helped that there had been prior European visits along the coast. Spanish explorers had skirted the area decades before, and perhaps fishermen too. So the native peoples were not utterly unknowing of outsiders. Still, this was a significant friendly contact. The English described the land in glowing terms when they later wrote of it. They were charmed by the abundance of fruit and game, the tall cedars and oaks, and the kindness of the people. In fact, when Amadis and Barlow returned to England later in 1584, they lavished praises on the land and its inhabitants, likening the place to an earthly paradise, a Garden of Eden of sorts. We can imagine them back at Raleigh's estate, or in the Queen's Court that autumn, recounting tales of an island with rich soil and gentle waters, teeming with fish and ready to support an English colony, all in an idyllic climate. They may have embellished a little to please Raleigh and the Queen, but that is human nature after all. But one thing they had definitely brought back spoke louder than words. 2 Native American guests accompanied them on the voyage home. These 2 Algonquin men were Wanchese and Manteo. Wanchese was a warrior from the Secotun tribe of Roanoke Island, and Manteo was from the nearby Croatoan people. His mother was actually the chieftain of Croatoan Island, today known as the Hatteras Island. Imagine the wonder and perhaps worry these 2 must have felt, sailing across the ocean to a distant foreign kingdom. In England, they caused quite a stir, evidence of Raleigh's success in finding new lands. They helped translate and taught the English about their culture, and in turn, they learned English. Manteo, notably, became a friendly ally to Raleigh's plans, while Wanchese grew more wary of English motives over time. But their presence in England strongly confirmed that the New World held real people and opportunities for alliance or conversion. Queen Elizabeth I was thrilled with the expedition's report. In a grand ceremony in 1585, she knighted Sir Walter Raleigh and officially proclaimed that the lands he found would be called Virginia. Raleigh had achieved the first step. He had reconnoitered the coastline and earned the Queen's confidence. Now it was time to plan a full-fledged colony. It's worth pausing here for a moment, as the courtly celebrations fade, to think about what this meant. For the first time, England was truly committing to establishing a settlement in America. There's excitement, but also much uncertainty. The world beyond the seas is not fully mapped. The dangers from storms to unknown tribes to Spanish patrols are real. Yet there is an adventurous glow to the endeavor, a belief that fortune favors the bold. Sir Walter Raleigh wasted little time after the successful 1584 scouting mission. By the very next spring, 1585, he had organized a larger expedition to establish a colony on the coast of the land they now call Virginia. This first colony would be more of a military outpost, largely men, soldiers, and sailors who would build a fort and search for useful resources. Raleigh's plan was to send a modest number of colonists first, then reinforce them with more settlers later. In the end, he sent about 7 ships and possibly up to 600 men in the fleet, though only around 100 or so would stay to form the colony. The rest were crew and additional forces that might return. The fleet that sailed in April 1585 was impressive for its time. It included a flagship named the Tiger, commanded by Sir Richard Grenville, who was Raleigh's cousin and a seasoned privateer. Also aboard were Ralph Lane, appointed to be the governor of the nascent colony, Philip Armadas from the first voyage, now to act as admiral of the colony, and other notable figures like Thomas Harriot, the scientist, and John White, the artist. They even brought back Manteo and Wanchese to return home. The two Algonquins who had traveled to England would now help re-establish relations upon arrival. One can imagine Manteo's relief to see his homeland again after the strange sight of London, and Wanchese perhaps carrying a seed of distrust after witnessing England's power. The voyage across the Atlantic was long and not without trouble. A severe storm in the Atlantic scattered the fleet, sinking one small ship and separating Grenville's flagship Tiger from the others. Eventually, after stops in the Caribbean where men practiced building a small fort and gathered supplies like fresh water and even captured Spanish cargo, the fleet, or what remained of it, reconvened in early summer on the Carolina coast. By June 1585, several ships reached the Outer Banks. One ship, the Red Lion, actually dropped off some men on Croatoan Island and then sailed away to seek Spanish prizes, leaving those men to fend until the others arrived. It was a tumultuous start, but by midsummer, Grenville had gathered enough of his expedition at Roanoke Island to establish a base. Now picture Roanoke Island in June of 1585. It's hot and humid. The island is a lush place about 8 miles long, sitting between the barrier islands and the mainland in the Albemarle-Pamlico Sound. Dense forests of pine and hardwood cover much of it, and its shores are lined with marshes and creeks where herons wade. The Sickaton people have a village on the northern end of the island. When the English arrive, relations are polite at first. They had the positive introduction from the 1584 voyage to build on, and Granganimio and Manteo helped maintain a friendship. The Sickaton people provided food and allowed the English to set up camp. Governor Ralph Lane chooses a spot presumably on the north end of Roanoke Island and orders a small fort to be constructed for the colony's defense. The English people begin to unload tools, nail together rough timber dwelling, and settle in. This first Roanoke colony, under Ralph Lane, faced challenges from the start. They were mostly soldiers and sailors, not farmers. They had hoped to find easy riches, maybe gold or spices, or at least good trade. But the reality of carving out a living hit hard. Supplies they brought were not infinite, and they arrived too late in the planting season to grow much. So they depended heavily on local tribes for food, trading for corn and fish. At first, the Sickaton, led now by Chief Wingina, had recovered from his earlier injury, tolerated them, and helped them. Wingina was cautious but hospitable initially. In fact, an interesting incident occurred. Wingina fell gravely ill sometime that year. Desperate, he asked the English to pray for him. The colonists did, and by chance or providence, Wingina recovered. This impressed the chief. He thought the English had great spiritual power, and he asked them to extend their prayers to other sick villagers. Sadly, this likely backfired, as it might have spread European diseases more widely among the natives when the colonists traveled around to pray for others. We can't be sure, but there are hints that an epidemic occurred affecting the fall harvest and straining the food supply for everyone. The Sickaton must have started feeling that these foreigners brought more trouble than blessing. As the months passed into early 1586, relations grew tense. The English were hungry, dependent, and sometimes not very diplomatic. Wingina, whose Algonquin name was often recorded as Pemesipan, began to see the colony as a threat. He and his advisors, including Wanchese, who had returned from England decidedly distrustful of the English, plotted to possibly starve the colonists or attack them. They gradually cut off the food supply, instructing villagers not to trade corn and relocating their own people away from the Roanoke area to deprive the English of assistance. The colonists grew increasingly anxious and hungry. Governor Ralph Lane, however, was a tough military man. He got wind of a potential plan by Wingina to unite other tribes against them. In June 1586, Lane decided to take preemptive action. In a tense and tragic turn, the English launched a surprise attack on the Sickaton leadership. Wingina was killed, caught and beheaded by Lane's men during a skirmish. The colonists displayed his severed head on a stake at their fort as a grim warning. This effectively ended the friendship with the Sickaton. From that point on, the English were truly isolated in a hostile land. After the death of Wingina, the situation of the Roanoke colony was dire. They had no steady food source, and now no local allies, only angry neighbors. It seemed only a matter of time before the colonists would suffer retaliation or starvation. But fate intervened in a curious way. In late June 1586, as if out of a storybook, a savior arrived by sea. None other than the famed Sir Francis Drake appeared off Roanoke with a fleet. Drake was returning to England after raiding Spanish cities in the Caribbean, and he decided to check on the Roanoke colonists. He found them in miserable shape, likely thin, nervous, and longing for rescue. Drake offered to evacuate them, or at least provide supplies. After some deliberation, Governor Lane and the surviving colonists chose to abandon the colony and sail back to England with Drake. In that summer of 1586, they packed what they could and boarded Drake's ship. The first English colony in America lasted less than a year before evacuation. One can imagine their relief as the sails filled and the Roanoke Island faded from view, but also their disappointment at the failure. Among those leaving was the scientist Thomas Harriot. in the artist John White, who carried back detailed notes and drawings of the New World's plants, animals, and people, an invaluable record of their experience. Incredibly, just 2 weeks after Drake evacuated Lane's colony, Sir Richard Grenville finally arrived with a resupply fleet that Raleigh had sent. Grenville found the fort deserted and no colonists to be seen. It said he found nothing but the bones of one unfortunate Englishman, one of the 15 men whom Grenville had left behind earlier on Croatoan Island had apparently been killed. Not wanting to lose claim to the region, Grenville left a small garrison of 15 soldiers on Roanoke Island to hold it for England, and then he sailed back to England himself. These 15 men, essentially stranded, and their fate would soon become another part of the darkening Roanoke tale. So ends the chapter of the first Roanoke colony. It had been a tale of high hopes, harsh realities, and bloodshed. But from this failure, lessons were learned, or so the English thought. Sir Walter Raleigh was not ready to give up his dream of a permanent English settlement. For him, and for Queen Elizabeth, the New World still beckoned. Perhaps a colony with a different approach would fare better. Instead of a militant outpost, maybe a true settlement of families could succeed, forming more genuine relations with the indigenous people and establishing an agricultural foothold. And so, plans for a second attempt at Roanoke began to take shape, this time including women and children among the colonists. As evening falls on the memory of Ralph Lane's fort, we drift onward to 1587 and the story of the lost colony that would pass into legend. The next effort to colonize Roanoke Island would become the famous Lost Colony. It's the summer of 1587 now, just 1 year after the evacuation of the first colony. Sir Walter Raleigh has adjusted his strategy. He appoints John White, the very same artist who had traveled previously, as the governor of the new colony. This time, the expedition consists of around 115 men, women, and children, ready to build a new life in America. It is one of the first groups of English families ever to attempt settling across the Atlantic. Imagine the scene aboard those ships. There would be the sounds of babies crying, mothers soothing them, and families huddled together on the gunwale watching the receding English coast, hopeful and perhaps anxious about the unknown land ahead. Raleigh's orders for 1587 were actually to establish the colony at Chesapeake Bay, a bit north of Roanoke, where the environment might be more favorable. However, when John White's fleet arrived at the Outer Banks in mid-July, circumstances changed their fate. They paused at Roanoke Island to check on the Grenville's 15 men left there. The pilot, Simon Fernandez, who captained one of the ships, made a fateful decision. He insisted that they disembark the colonists on Roanoke Island itself, instead of moving on to Chesapeake Bay. Historians have debated why. Perhaps Fernandez wanted to be rid of his passenger load, or feared late-season hurricanes if they sailed further. In any case, Governor White found himself forced to settle on Roanoke Island once again, whether he liked it or not. When White and the new colonists stepped ashore at Roanoke in July 1587, they found the place eerily quiet. The fort and houses left behind by Ralph Lane's group were still there, but overgrown with weeds and vines. Nature was quickly reclaiming the area. Of Grenville's 15 soldiers, no living trace was found, only the bleached bones of one man, indicating a violent end. It seemed those men had likely been killed or driven off by local tribes. Nevertheless, the colonists began preparing the houses and rebuilding the small fort to use as their home base. They must have worked hard under the summer sun, sweating as they hammered planks and patched thatched roofs, trying to create shelter for the women and children as quickly as possible. One advantage the new colony had was the return of their native friend Manteo. Manteo had been to England twice now and was firmly on the English side. He acted as an intermediary with the local tribes. The new colonists tried to renew friendly relations, especially with the Croatoan people who lived on the nearby barrier island. The Croatoan, being Manteo's people, were generally more welcoming than the Cicotans. As a gesture of goodwill, and perhaps a political move by Raleigh, Manteo was baptized into the Church of England and given the title Lord of Roanoke, the Samemkampunk, rather ceremonial European title, in August 1587. This moment, a mix of sincere friendship and symbolic alliance, must have been quite a scene. Colonists and curious natives gathered as Manteo received his Christian baptism, water trickling over his forehead in the warm sun, officially joining the Englishman's faith. However, not all was well. A harsh reminder of past hostilities still struck. Only days after they landed, one of the colonists, George Howe, was out alone near the shore, perhaps crabbing or exploring, when he was attacked and killed by a group of native warriors. These were believed to be men of the Cicotan, or related tribes from the mainland, still angry over last year's conflict. Howe was found shot through with an arrow and brutally slain. His death sent a wave of fear through the colony. Governor White, seeking to prevent further violence, consulted Manteo and decided to retaliate carefully. But a tragic mistake occurred. White led some armed men to strike the supposed hostile group on the mainland. In the dusk and confusion, they ambushed what they thought were enemy warriors, only to discover they had attacked a band of friendly Croatoan Indians, Manteo's own people, who were coming to help. This blunder further frayed trust. Although Manteo remained loyal, surely the Croatoan were shaken by the friendly fire. Despite these early setbacks, life went on. The colonists knew they needed more supplies and help from England to survive long term. By late August 1587, they unanimously agreed that Governor John White should sail back to England to gather relief for the colony. It was a difficult decision. White's own daughter, Eleanor Dare, was one of the colonists, and she was about to give birth. In fact, on August 18, 1587, just days before White's departure, Eleanor gave birth to a baby girl named Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. Imagine that tiny infant's arrival in this strange new land, her first cries mingling with the sighing pine leaves and the distant crash of the Atlantic waves. To the colonists, baby Virginia must have been a symbol of hope and new beginnings. They baptized her into the Anglican faith, and her birthday would later become a celebrated anniversary back in America as the centuries pass. With an infant and many other dependents in the colony, the need for resupply was urgent. White likely felt torn about leaving. The colonists implored him to go, as he was the best connected to Raleigh and the investors for aid. And so, in late August, John White set sail back across the sea, heavy with worry but determined. He left behind approximately 115 colonists on Roanoke, including his daughter, his newborn granddaughter, and his son-in-law, among many other men and women whose names history mostly remembers only in lists. These colonists watched the sails of White's ship disappear over the horizon, expecting him to return in a few months with fresh supplies, more colonists, perhaps reinforcements, everything needed to make their new home secure. Little did they know, a perfect storm of circumstance was about to delay John White's return, far beyond what anyone imagined. The story now shifts back to England, and then again to Roanoke, where an unsettling mystery will soon unfold. John White's voyage back to England in 1587 was swift enough, but upon arriving he found his homeland in panic and turmoil. War had erupted between England and Spain. The Spanish king, Philip II, was sending his mighty armada to invade England in 1588, and every ship and able-bodied sailor in England was being pressed into national service to fend off this threat. Because of this, Queen Elizabeth forbade any ships from leaving for the Americas, as they were needed to defend the realm. White, desperate to return to his family and colony with supplies, was stuck. For nearly 3 years, John White was unable to secure a passage back to Roanoke. Think of how agonizing that wait must have been for him, each month passing with no word from across the ocean, imagining what hardships the colonists must be enduring. Did they have enough food? Were they safe from conflict? White must have lobbied Raleigh and others constantly to send a relief mission. Raleigh himself, although concerned, was tied up with the war effort and other ventures, and perhaps assumed the colonists could hold out a little longer. It wasn't until 1590 that John White finally gained passage on a small privateer fleet heading to the Caribbean. He persuaded them to stop at Roanoke on the way. By now, the war with Spain had calmed. The Spanish Armada had been defeated in 1588, in part by terrible weather and English naval resistance, but the delay had been immense. So now our scene shifts to August 1590. Imagine John White standing on the deck of a ship as it approaches the Outer Banks once more. 3 years had passed since he left Roanoke. He looked anxiously for any sign of life on the familiar island. On August 18th, 1590, which happened to be little Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday, White and a landing party finally reached Roanoke Island. What they found has become one of the great mysteries of history. It was quiet, too quiet. White expected, or at least hoped, to see people rushing out to greet them, overjoyed at the long-awaited arrival of supplies. Instead, as the sailors rowed ashore, they saw nothing but a ghost village. The houses and fort structures the colonists had built were dismantled and in disrepair. Grass and wild melon vines grew where pathways had been, Not a single person stirred. The only sound was the wind in the trees and the gentle buzz of insects on that summer day. The men called out, but no answer came, except perhaps the echo of their own shouts across the water. As Governor White and his crew cautiously entered the old fort site, they came upon a puzzling clue. Carved into one of the upright wooden posts of the palisade was a single word, in capital letters, Croatoan. In another place on a nearby tree, they found the letters CRO carved into the bark. White's heart must have leapt at this discovery. He had made an arrangement with the colonists back in 1587. If they ever had to relocate, they were to carve the name of their destination, and if they left due to danger or distress, they should carve a Maltese cross. White rushed to inspect the carvings closely. The word Croatoan stood clear, which was the name of the Croatoan Island about 50 miles south. Crucially, there was no cross or distress sign carved anywhere near the word. This strongly suggested that the colonists had decided to move to Croatoan Island of their own accord, and not in desperation or under attack. At that moment, John White must have felt a mix of relief and concern. Relief that perhaps his family and friends were still alive, living with the friendly Croatoan tribe. Concern because they weren't here and he had limited time and means to search further. Inside the settlement, further evidence supported the idea that the colonists had left intentionally and orderly. The houses hadn't been burned or destroyed by violence. They had been carefully taken apart with useful wood and materials likely taken with the colonists. There were no English corpses, no signs of a mass fight or massacre. Almost all the valuables and belongings were gone too, implying that the people packed their things and left rather than fleeing empty-handed. White did find some large chests that he himself had buried on the site before leaving in 1587. They had been dug up and rifled through, their contents spoiled by weather and wild animals. It appears that whatever was left behind had been looted, possibly by local tribes or other opportunists after the colonists left. Also notably missing were all the small boats the colony had. None were found on the shore. It seems the colonists had taken their pinnace, or rowboats, when they departed Roanoke, which would make sense if they decided to relocate by water. John White must have walked through the silent fort with a heavy heart. He had dearly hoped to see his daughter and his little granddaughter. Now he had no one to greet, only these tantalizing carvings. Why had they moved? Were they okay? Croatoan Island was home to Mantio's people who were friendly. That boded well, at least. Perhaps the colony, feeling endangered or simply too hungry to survive at Roanoke, had decided to join the Croatoans. This was White's assumption, that they had relocated and were likely alive about 50 miles away. His immediate plan was to sail down to Croatoan Island and check. However, fate intervened cruelly once more. White returned to the anchored ships that evening, and overnight a terrible storm blew up. The summer Atlantic churned with sudden violence, buffeting their ships and actually snapping the anchor cable of one, dragging it dangerously close to shore. The captain and crew, anxious about losing their ship on the shoals, insisted that they must leave the area to ride out the tempest. White pleaded with them to go to Croatoan Island as promised, but in the chaos, one ship even lost an anchor entirely, and the men grew skittish about continuing the mission. When the weather calmed, the plan changed. The crew decided they had had enough delays and needed to head back to England. They were privateers by trade and had already spent time looking for any Spanish prizes. John White begged them to make one more attempt to sail to Croatoan, or at least wait for a better opportunity. But supplies were low and morale was lower. The compromise was to sail to the Caribbean for the winter and return to search in spring. But misfortune struck again. Their ship was blown off course, and eventually they abandoned the search and limped back to England on October 1590. John White would never get another chance to find his colonists. He wrote anguished accounts of what he found or failed to find, describing the code word Croatoan and his interpretation of it. To the end of his life, White believed that his daughter, granddaughter, and the others had gone to live with the Croatoan tribe on Hatteras Island and perhaps beyond. In England, however, interest in the matter waned as other pressing concerns took center stage. Sir Walter Raleigh, as long as the colonists' fate was unknown, legally maintained his patent on Virginia. But Raleigh himself got caught up in political troubles and eventually fell out of favor. He was later imprisoned and eventually executed years down the line for unrelated reasons. No strong, well-funded relief effort ever departed solely to find the Roanoke colonists. And thus, the 115 men, women, and children of Roanoke vanished into history. Their exact fate unknown, their settlement earning the title the Lost Colony. The emptiness that John White encountered has echoed through the years. Imagine him, an old man in England, replaying memories of Roanoke, the laughter and hopes during the colony's early days, and the silence and Croatoan carving that greeted his return. It must have haunted him. For years, and then decades, nobody knew for sure what happened to these colonists. In time, Virginia Dare became a nearly mythical figure, the first English child of America, lost with scarcely a trace. People would speculate and wonder, spinning tales around campfires and later writing books and plays about the lost colony. Before we drift further into speculation, let's recount what concrete efforts were made in the aftermath to solve this mystery, and what clues, however faint, were gathered by those who came after. In the immediate aftermath of Roanoke's disappearance, there were a few attempts to investigate, but they were limited and often ill-fated. Sir Walter Raleigh, for one, had a vested interest in maintaining that the colony might still be alive. As long as it was not proven lost, his rights in Virginia remained valid. He even stated that the colonists could be found alive, hoping to justify further expeditions, or at least keep potential rivals from moving in. Behind the scenes, however, many in England likely assumed the worst, that the colonists had perished. Raleigh did fund one last expedition in 1602, led by Captain Samuel Mace, specifically to look for survivors. But this voyage had a dual purpose. It was also after profitable goods like the medicinal plant sassafras, which was fetching high prices in Europe. Mace's ship spent more time harvesting sassafras, far to the south, than searching the Outer Banks, and when they finally neared Croatoan Island, bad weather again prevented thorough exploration. They returned to England empty-handed in terms of news of the colonists. That same year, 1603, Raleigh himself fell from grace, accused of treason by the new King James, and was imprisoned. effectively ending his direct role in the colony's affairs. Another small expedition was mounted in 1603 by Bartholomew Gilbert, son of Raleigh's half-brother Sir Humphrey Gilbert. He aimed for the Chesapeake Bay area to see if the Roanoke colonists might have gone there. Recall, Chesapeake was the original intended site. Gilbert's party met a tragic end. They landed near Chesapeake Bay, were attacked by Native Americans for unknown reasons, and Gilbert and several others were killed. The survivors sailed back to England with nothing to show. It seemed the lost colony did not want to be found. The next phase of investigation came with the establishment of Jamestown in 1607, the first successful English colony in Virginia. The Jamestown settlers knew of the Roanoke mystery and were instructed by the Virginia Company to inquire about the lost colony. Captain John Smith of Jamestown, famous for Pocahontas and all that, did gather some intriguing reports. In 1608, Smith heard from local Powhatan Indians about a place in the interior where men wore European-style clothing. Another report told of a village with walled houses, which sounded unusual and vaguely European. Smith also received secondhand stories that a group of people called Roanoke be living with other tribes. One such story he relayed was that Chief Powhatan to have orchestrated the killing of some colonists living with a rival tribe, possibly in the Chesapeake area, before the Jamestown settlers arrived. According to a later account by Samuel Purchas, an English writer in 1625, Powhatan boasted to John Smith that he had massacred the Roanoke colonists. However, John Smith never mentioned this claim in his own writings, which raises questions about its accuracy. Perhaps Powhatan did say something of the sort, or perhaps it was a misunderstanding or exaggeration passed through gossip. We do know that Powhatan had a history of eliminating groups he saw as threats, including a nearby tribe called the Chesapeans, who some speculated might have harbored the Roanoke survivors. But without confirmation, the Powhatan massacre story remains one possible thread unproven and doubted by historians. Another intriguing clue from Jamestown's times is the Zuniga map, drawn in 1608. Pedro de Zuniga, the Spanish ambassador in London, acquired a crude map from an informant, likely from Jamestown, that marked the location of certain Indian settlements where colonists or their descendants were rumored to live. On this map was noted, "Here remaineth 4 men clothed, that came from Roanoke," indicating that 4 men from Roanoke were supposedly alive under a certain chief's protection somewhere inland. This suggests at least a belief or rumor that some survivors, perhaps male colonists, were integrated into native society. The Virginia Company in London, hearing these reports, even sent orders to Jamestown Colony to try and find these lost people. They proposed relocating Jamestown closer to where survivors might be and mentioned a place on the Chowan River that sounded promising. Unfortunately, Jamestown had its own crisis and did not follow through vigorously. A couple of search parties were sent out from Jamestown in 1608 and 1609, but they returned saying they found no sign of the lost colony living nearby. In 1610, a man named William Strachey arrived in Jamestown and later wrote an account, The History of Travail into Virginia Britannia, in which he gave yet another version of the Roanoke fate. Strachey claimed that the colonists had lived for 20 years peacefully with a tribe beyond Powhatan's domain. But then, prompted by priests, Powhatan supposedly attacked and slaughtered most of them just before Jamestown settlers came, leaving only a few survivors who fled inland. Strachey even said 7 colonists survived that attack, 4 men, 2 boys, and a young woman who escaped towards the Chowan River area and were protected by a friendly chief there. They supposedly lived in a place called Roanoke, which may correspond to a region where copper was mined, as per native stories, and worked as metal workers, beating copper for the chief. Strachey did not cite how he knew this, and might have been from conversations with natives or from other colonial leaders. His account, written in 1612, added color to the idea that at least a handful of Roanoke colonists were still alive as of 1607 to 1608, only to meet a grim fate just as England was re-establishing a presence in Virginia. These early accounts from Jamestown times all differ in details, but a common thread is the suggestion that the Roanoke colonists left Roanoke Island and dispersed among various native communities. Some hints point to the south, Croatoan Island, some to the north, Chesapeake, or up in the Albemarle Sound, some westward inland. It's possible all could have a grain of truth. The colonists might have split into groups or moved in stages. After the Jamestown era, interest in the lost colony faded for a long while. By the 1700s, however, as English settlers populated the Carolina coast and inland, they still heard stories. One fascinating account comes from John Lawson, an explorer and the first historian of North Carolina, who traveled through the region in 1701. Lawson visited Hatteras Island and met native people living there, who were likely descendants of the Croatoan tribe. These people told Lawson something astonishing. Several of their ancestors were white, and some even had gray eyes, which are uncommon among Native Americans. The Hatteras people believed they had forebears who came from Roanoke. Lawson took this as evidence that the Croatoan had indeed taken in the lost colony, intermarrying and assimilating with them. He wrote in 1709 that it is likely that the colonists mingled with the indigenous people to survive. Lawson even found the remains of what he thought was a ruined fort on Hatteras Island, possibly the fort built by leftover Grenville men or by the colonists themselves, as well as old English items like coins, firearm, and a powder horn in the area. These findings suggested that English presence had at some point been on Hatteras after 1590, though by Lawson's time, all that was left were whispers of ancestry and scattered relics. This notion that the lost colonists assimilated with local tribes is a peaceful and intriguing solution to the mystery. It means that instead of dying out, they lived on through their children, absorbed into native society. It's a comforting thought in a way, and one that we'll revisit among the theories. Lawson's testimony is one of the earliest semi-official records hinting at that outcome. By the 1800s, the story of the lost colony began to capture the American imagination in earnest. Writers and historians started retelling the tale, turning it into a foundational American mystery, kind of like a legend of our nation's infancy. Virginia Dare became a symbol of American birth and pioneer spirit, and her vanishing a symbol of mystery. In 1895, even President James Monroe made a point to visit Roanoke Island's remains. By then, the original site by the North Shore had mostly eroded into the sea, but people still knew generally where the fort had been. For the 19th century onward, many researchers, archaeologists, and treasure hunters have hunted for clues to the lost colony's fate. We'll talk about what modern findings and theories have emerged shortly. But before we do, let's gather ourselves in the present moment of our story. James White had left the scene. Centuries have passed, and we're left with an enduring question. What really happened to the lost colonists of Roanoke? It's time to explore the theories one by one, separating what evidence we have from the speculations that fill in the blanks. Now we arrive at the part of our sleepy journey where we explore every major theory that has been proposed about the fate of the Roanoke colonists. This is like wandering through a quiet forest of possibilities, each path gently leading us to a different imagined end. Some of these paths have footprints and broken twigs that suggest someone went that way. Other paths disappear into moonlit fog, more fanciful than real. We'll walk each one slowly and see what we can find. Remember, our aim is not to solve the mystery definitively. Many great minds have tried and still debate it. But to appreciate the mystery in all its rich detail. Along the way, we'll clearly note which ideas have support from historical or archaeological findings, and which rest mostly in lore or conjecture. Let's begin our exploration of what might have happened after 1587 in a gentle, open-minded manner. Theory 1. Integration with the Croatoan tribe. One of the oldest and most enduring theories is that the Roanoke colonists relocated to the Croatoan Island and assimilated with the friendly Croatoan people. This theory started with John White's own interpretation. The Croatoan carving was clearly meant as a message pointing to Croatoan Island. White believed the colonists went there, and we know they had a standing invitation of sorts. Mantio's people were allies, and Croatoan Island was relatively safe from the more hostile mainland tribes. Evidence supporting this idea includes John Lawson's 1701 account, where the Hatteras descendants claim to have had white ancestors with great eyes. Lawson's discovery of English artifacts and a fort's remains on Hatteras suggests that English folks lived there at one point. In modern times, archaeological digs in Hatteras Island have uncovered various late 16th century European objects, a slate writing tablet, parts of swords and guns, a fragment of a rapier hilt, pottery shards of the type used by Elizabethan English, and even a decorative clothing clasp that would have belonged to an English woman. These were found by researchers like Scott Dawson and the Croatoan Archaeological Society in recent years. Dawson, a native of Hatteras, is a strong proponent of the idea that the lost colonists moved to Hatteras and lived alongside the Croatoan tribe. The mix of artifacts, some clearly European and of the correct time period, is compelling. For example, the writing slate found with a letter still faintly visible on it might well have belonged to someone who expected to correspond or keep notes, a tool colonists would value and perhaps carry with them. It's not the sort of trade items native people would likely value unless English were present to use it. Additionally, the Croatoan island theory fits with the fact that no distress signal was left, implying the move was planned and peaceful. Croatoan was known to have limited food resources, but perhaps the colonists thought they could live off fishing and support from the Croatoan tribe, or use it as a stepping stone to another location. Maybe they were awaiting John White's return in a safer place. Or they could have intended to eventually move on from Croatoan further inland or north after regrouping. No conclusive proof has yet been found that specifically screams Lost Colony was here, such as a piece of armor with the colonist's name or remains of English-style houses on Hatteras. But the combination of oral history, Lawson's report, and artifacts strongly suggests some presence. Many researchers find this theory highly plausible, that at least a portion of the colony indeed went to live with Mantio's people. Over time, they would have intermarried, their children growing up more native than English, and the distinct English colony would have faded into a blended community. It's a peaceful image, the colonists finding shelter in friendship with the Croatoan, surviving the harsh drought years by learning native ways. Perhaps Virginia Dare herself grew to be a young woman running on those beaches, a child of two worlds. One challenge to this theory is that Croatoan Island might not have been able to support 100+ extra people for long. It had limited farmland and fresh water, and the Croatoan population itself wasn't huge. It's possible not all colonists went there, or that if they did, they didn't stay permanently. Some could have moved further after a short time. It's also possible the colonists split into groups early, some going to Croatoan and others elsewhere. Nevertheless, assimilation with local tribes, starting with Croatoan, is one of the leading explanations favored by many historians today. Theory 2. Migration inland, up the Albemarle Sound. Another theory suggests the colonists may have moved inland 50 miles into the Main, as Governor White had instructed them to do if they left the island. This could mean they traveled up into the broad estuaries in rivers west of Roanoke Island, such as following the Albemarle Sound, or one of the big rivers, the Roanoke, the Chowan, or Pamlico River. Notably, in John White's personal notes and the secret symbol on his map, there was an indication that the colony intended to relocate inland. In 2012, researchers at the British Museum examined White's map, La Virginia Pars, which he drew during the 1580s, and found a tiny fort-like symbol hidden under a patch near the confluence of Roanoke and Chowan rivers. This is about 50 miles west of Roanoke Island. Some think White or Raleigh covered that symbol to keep it secret from the Spanish, indicating a planned location for a new settlement further in. It suggests perhaps the colonists had a prearranged plan to move inland, where it might be safer and more fertile. Archaeology lends some weight here as well. The area near the Chowan River in the Bertie County, North Carolina, specifically around a place called Site X in modern times, has yielded late 16th century English artifacts as well. The First Colony Foundation, a group of professional and archaeologists and historians, conducted excavations in the 2010s near the location indicated by the map's patch. They found fragments of English pottery from the 1500s and bits of metal weapons in sites along the Salmon Creek and the Cashy River. These included pieces of a ceramic known as Surrey, Hampshire borderware, which is typical of household goods from the 16th century England, not the sort of thing Jamestown settlers, 20 years later, would likely have carried, and not likely to be traded to natives either. Also found were some green-glazed pottery and a bit of early gun hardware. The location is in the vicinity of an old native village called Metaquim. The idea is that a contingent of the Roanoke colonists might have gone inland to live among the Wet'miac or Roanoke tribes, who had been relatively friendly. Manitonin, a Roanoke chief, had treated Ralph Lane kindly back in 1586 and spoke of fertile lands upriver. Perhaps Manteo helped broker that as well, or maybe the colonists on their own sought out these communities. One historian, Thomas Paramore, theorized that the colonists made their way to the Wet'miac people along the Albemarle Sound, seeing that as a good place to settle and farm, but later got caught in conflicts between indigenous tribes. Yet the presence of pottery suggests that they at least reached that area. The inland migration theory dovetails with some of the Jamestown-era reports of European-looking natives in various inland locations. The fact that no overt traces, like a Lost Colony fort, have been found inland can be due to several reasons. The colonists may not have built a distinct fort or village of their own, but rather integrated into existing native villages or built structures that left little trace. Also, the region is large and not fully excavated. Traces could remain undiscovered or have been lost to time. We must keep in mind, a lot of the area's history is hidden in layers of earth and has only been partially explored by archaeologists. This theory carries the possibility that not all colonists stayed together. Perhaps a portion went to Croatoan, and another portion moved inland. There may have been a plan. For example, some historians speculate the colony might have intended a two-part move. First to a safer interim location, Croatoan, then onward to a richer land, perhaps by the Chowan River. The truth might not be a single theory, but a blend. Theory 3. Relocation to Chesapeake Bay and Powhatan's revenge. Another significant theory is that the colonists attempted to go north to the Chesapeake Bay area in present-day Virginia. After all, Raleigh's original plan for the city of Raleigh was at Chesapeake Bay, a region believed to have better harbors and soils. Perhaps the Roanoke colonists, once they lost hope of White's quick return, decided to try to reach the Chesapeake on their own. They had a pinnace, a small ship, or could build boats. The journey would involve navigating some open ocean around Cape Hatteras, which was tricky. The National Park Service notes that none of the colonists were skilled navigators or captains, which cast doubt if they could really achieve that voyage to Chesapeake. However, they might have hugged the shoreline or used native canoes. There is a tantalizing story. As mentioned earlier, Chief Powhatan allegedly admitted to ordering the killing of a group of people living in his domain who were not of his tribe. One account from 1608 said these people were living with the Chesapeakean tribe in the lower Chesapeake area, and that Powhatan wiped them out because a prophecy said those people would rise up against him. If those people were indeed the Roanoke settlers, it suggests they did travel up the Chesapeake and lived there for about 20 years before being massacred around 1607, just as the English were arriving in Jamestown. This would weirdly coincide with Strachey's version of events as well. The Jamestown settlers did learn in 1607 to 1609 that men wearing European apparel had been seen around the Chesapeake and other inland villages. When Jamestown colonists questioned the Powhatan about the Roanoke people, one claim was that there had indeed been some survivors among the tribe that were killed in warfare. No solid archaeological evidence has turned up in the Chesapeake Bay region. Remember that Jamestown itself was in the Chesapeake Bay area, and they looked around but found nothing conclusive. If the colonists did move there and then were killed, any European goods they had might have been taken by the Powhatans or others, or any structures they built would have been reclaimed by force. So absence of evidence is not proof one way or another. This theory is less popular among modern scholars, partly because it relies heavily on Powhatan's second-hand, possibly self-aggrandizing claim. Powhatan might have been trying to scare or impress John Smith, and because it seems the colonists would have needed maritime skills they didn't have to reach Chesapeake on their own. Still, it cannot be entirely discounted. Perhaps a small band of them attempted to sail north and met this fate, while others did not. Theory 4. Spanish attack or abduction. Remember, at this time, the 1580s, Spain considered any English outposts in La Florida, their name for the whole southeast, as a threat to be eliminated. It's true that the Spanish in Florida were aware of Raleigh's colony to some extent. In fact, in 1587, a Spanish ship captured an English pilot and gleaned that a colony was at the Chesapeake, or Chesapeake. The Spanish King Philip II dispatched an expedition led by Captain Vicente Gonzalez in 1588 to find and destroy this English colony. Gonzalez sailed up the coast and actually missed the colony, partly because by 1588, Roanoke Island was temporarily deserted. White hadn't returned yet, and Grenville's men were gone, so there were no obvious signs. Gonzalez did notice a channel or mooring that suggested Europeans had been in the area, but he found no one. He reported back that the colony must have failed or moved. So the Spanish Armada then targeted England directly. In an expected Spanish follow-up to eradicate any English in the Chesapeake didn't materialize then. Now, could the Spanish have later found the Roanoke colonists and attacked them? White saw no indication of a Spanish raid when he arrived in 1590. No bodies, no destruction. Also, if Spain had captured or killed them, it likely would have been noted in Spanish records, and none existed that claimed a successful hit on the Roanoke colonists. Spanish archives have been searched by historians, and nothing conclusive about Roanoke's demise has come up. However, a twist to consider. What if the colonists, in desperation, tried to sail south to Spanish territory, perhaps to seek help or capture a Spanish ship? If they did so, they could have been caught by Spanish authorities and treated as pirates or prisoners. We have no hint of English captives from Roanoke showing up in Spanish accounts. Thus, while a Spanish attack is a plausible worry they had, and indeed, the colonists were fearful of the Spanish in 1587, which is why they built their forts well, and perhaps why they dismantled houses, if moving, to avoid leaving anything for Spanish eyes. There's no evidence it happened. John White himself explicitly noted he saw no sign of a struggle or battle at the site. So the Spanish theory, once a popular suggestion in older histories, is largely dismissed by experts today. It remains an interesting what if, but lacks supporting proof. Theory 5. Starvation, drought, and disease. Sometimes the simplest explanation considered is that the colony may have just died out due to starvation or disease. The late 1580s brought adversity. We have scientific evidence that a severe drought struck the region from 1587 to 1589, the worst in 800 years around that time. Tree ring data from Virginia indicate that 1587 was an exceptionally bad year for rainfall, which would have decimated crops and reduced food available from the forests and rivers. The colonists were already low on supplies when White left. If the local tribes had scant food due to drought, they wouldn't be able to trade with much either. It's conceivable some colonists starved or fell ill as malnutrition set in. Diseases could have taken a toll too. New illnesses contracted from natives or brought by the English themselves. Tropical diseases from the southern climate or simple epidemics like dysentery could sweep through a weakened colony. However, there's reason to doubt that everyone simply died in place from hunger or disease. When White returned in 1590, he did not find mass graves or skeletal remains in the settlement. If famine or plague had wiped out the colony on the island, one would expect at least some signs. Bodies hastily buried or not at all. Instead, the site was tidily abandoned. Also, if famine had been extreme, they might not have had the strength or organization to carve messages and take down houses. The careful dismantling suggests an orderly relocation, not chaotic collapse. That said, famine and disease could have been part of the story after relocation. For instance, if they moved inland or to Hatteras, they still faced the drought condition regionally. Perhaps some colonists succumbed to illness over the years. It's likely a few did die early on. In any large group, some will fall to sickness or accident. George Howe was killed, and surely others might have perished in the 3 years while awaiting rescue. But disease alone does not explain the disappearance of the entirety of the colony without trace. One interesting angle. Maybe they split up into small groups because of limited food. Smaller bands could survive the winter more easily by foraging and moving. A large group of 115 might have been unsustainable, so they could have fragmented into several groups, each seeking sustenance and refuge separately. Some group might have died off, others could have survived. In summary, Drought and famine likely put the colonists under great stress. It might have forced them to relocate or seek help from indigenous neighbors, lending to assimilation or conflict. But famine or disease alone causing total die-off doesn't neatly fit the evidence we have. Theory 6. Conflict and massacre by native tribes. Another grim possibility is that at some point after John White left, the colonists met with violent conflict. Perhaps Chief Wagina's tribe, Sickaton, or their allies still resentful, eventually attacked the colony at Roanoke. It could be that in the spring of 1588 or 1589, relations soured badly and warriors descended on the settlement. If so, maybe the colonists fled in a hurry, hence leaving behind card messages while escaping, or they were captured or killed. However, again, John White saw no sign of battle at the fort site. No blood, no damage to structures from combat. If an attack had happened there, one would think there'd be burn marks, or bullet holes, or arrowheads. The dismantling of houses doesn't fit a sudden attack scenario. It could be that conflict happened after they moved. Let's say some colonists integrated into a tribe. Maybe the Wet'miac or Roanoke as suggested by the inland theory. Those tribes had their own enemies like the Sickaton or the Mandoag from further inland. It's possible the colonists got caught in intertribal warfare. Historian Thomas Paramore speculated exactly that. The colonists who went to live with the Wet'miac might have later been attacked by a coalition of other natives and wiped out in fighting among tribes. This aligns with Strachey's account, where he says the colonists lived peacefully for 20 years and then were massacred by Powhatan at the urging of his priest. If any colonists did make it north to Chesapeake territory, they could have indeed been eliminated by Powhatan's forces around 1607, as he claimed. So, the massacre theory often ties to the Powhatan story. Given the lack of physical evidence, this remains possible but unproven. It's sobering to consider that perhaps none of the colonists ultimately survived beyond a certain point due to violence, except perhaps a very few who might have been kept as slaves or absorbed into victor tribes. One interesting note: later Cherokee and Lambee oral histories from inland North Carolina sometimes claim that some white people joined their tribes. And in the 1800s, some local lore in North Carolina said that certain family lines of native or mixed ancestry were descended from the Lost Colony. These are anecdotal and controversial, but they fuel the idea that not all met a violent end. Some lineage continued. Theory 7. Multiple small groups, the scatter theory. It's entirely possible the truth isn't one single fate, but a combination. Picture the colonists holding a meeting in late 1587 or 1588 after White doesn't return on schedule. They might have debated, should we stay here and wait longer or move on? Perhaps they decided that remaining at Roanoke Island was too risky. Low food, unfriendly neighbors, very exposed. They could have resolved to split up. Maybe some would go to Croatoan with Manteo. Others would try for Chesapeake. Others go inland to seek the Roanoke. By spreading out, they increase the chance that at least one group might find sustenance or friendly hosts. It also, unfortunately for us, increases the chance that each smaller group's story ended differently, and the evidence trail for each would be thin. One group could have perished in a storm at sea, another died in conflict, another survived through intermarriage. Why would they split? Possibly because no one path guaranteed survival, and they didn't want to put all their eggs in one basket. Or perhaps disagreements in leadership led to splits. Governor White was absent. Leadership may have fallen to someone like Ananias Dare, Virginia's father, or George Howe, but he died. They might not have had unanimous opinion on what to do. The scatter theory fits with why hints of the colonists appeared in multiple directions. Croatoan pointing south, Jamestown hearing of 4 men to the west, Powhatan's claim of killing some to the north. It could all be true concurrently in parts. Theory 8. The Dare Stones. We should touch on one of the strangest supposed evidence, the Dare Stones. Beginning in 1937, a series of engraved stones were allegedly found across parts of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, telling a tale in Elizabethan-era English of what happened to the lost colonists. The first stone was said to be found by a man named Lewis Hammond by the Chowan River, not far from where Site X would later be identified. It had an inscription that, if authentic, was by Eleanor White Dare, John White's daughter and Virginia's mother. It addressed John White, saying that Ananias Dare and Virginia had died. When Hints Unto Heaven 1591, it read, and that of the colonists, many had been slain by savages, and only a few survived. On the back was a longer inscription, telling that only 7 of the colonists were left living, and indicating where the deaths had happened. Signed EWD, Eleanor White Dare. This first stone, if it were real, would remarkably corroborate Straight G's 7 survivor massacre theory and the timeline of Virginia Dare dying as a child. Emory University examined that stone in the late 1930s. Soon after, dozens more Dare stones turned up, most traced to a stonecutter who likely forged them as a hoax. Those later stones, with elaborate tales of traveling to Georgia and Eleanor remarrying, are considered fake. The first stone, however, is still a subject of debate because its language and weathering are somewhat more convincing. But most experts also lean toward it being a hoax, or at least not fully accepted. The Dare stones are a fascinating footnote, probably more fiction than fact. If nothing else, they show how the lost colony captured imaginations to the point people literally carved out a story for them. We include them here for completeness, but emphasize that most historians dismiss them as fraud. They're part of the legend now, but not credible evidence. Theory 9. Supernatural and otherworldly ideas. Roanoke's mysterious vanishing has given rise not only to historical theories, but to folklore and supernatural tales. Over the years, some have wondered if something spooky or inexplicable befell the colony. These theories are not supported by science, of course, but they can be eerie fun to consider in the realm of legend. Perhaps not too scary, since this is a bedtime story. One such legend is tied to the very word Croatoan. Beyond the lost colony, The word Croatoan has developed a ghostly reputation by surfacing in later tales of unexplained disappearances. Several famous mysteries over the century have claimed a connection to this eerie word, weaving a thread of folklore that stretched far beyond Roanoke. The death of the famous horror author Edgar Allan Poe is shrouded in mystery, and a chilling legend claims Croatoan was the last word he uttered. In October 1849, Poe was found delirious in the streets of Baltimore and taken to a hospital where he died without explaining what happened to him. According to some accounts, during his final delirium, Poe called out incoherently, allegedly murmuring the name Reynolds, and then the word Croatoan shortly before he died. This has never been confirmed. His attending physician's records were lost, but the story persists. The idea that the master of the macabre whispered Croatoan with his dying breath adds an extra chill to Poe's mysterious end, even if historians suspect this detail to be more legend than fact. Amelia Earhart's disappearance over the Pacific is one of the 20th century's great unsolved mysteries. Other than navigational records, no trace of Earhart or her plane was ever found, but later, folklore tied her fate to the Roanoke enigma as well. Some stories claimed that Earhart had written the word Croatoan in her journal or flight log shortly before her final flight. In one telling, the alleged note was discovered in papers recovered after she vanished. In truth, there is no credible evidence that Earhart ever inscribed that word. Most historians consider this modern myth. Still, the image of America's most famous missing pilot, jotting Croatoan as a last cryptic warning, has a bone-chilling appeal. It's as if the Lost Colony's ghostly whisper briefly crossed Earhart's path, a haunting coincidence that, while likely invented, deepened the mystique of her tragedy. Perhaps the most intriguing Croatoan legend involves a real ghost ship found not far from Roanoke's waters. The Carroll A. Deering was a 5-masted schooner that ran aground on Diamond Shoals off Cape Hatteras, the very area once known as Croatoan Island, in January 1921. When rescuers finally reached the stranded ship, they found it completely abandoned. The crew of 10 had vanished without a trace. According to accounts, the scene on board was oddly undisturbed. A fresh meal was reportedly left on the galley stove, and personal belongings were gone, but there were no signs of struggle. In later lore, a sinister clue was said to be left behind as well, the word Croatoan. Some versions of the story insist that Croatoan was found carved into one of Deering's masts, while others claimed it was scribbled in the ship's logbook as the last entry. In reality, official investigations by the U.S. Coast Guard and FBI never documented any such carving or note. The Croatoan detail appears to have been a sensational addition. Nonetheless, this rumor has become part of the Deering legend, given that the shipwreck so close to Roanoke's old location. The tale of Croatoan on a deserted vessel makes the Lost Colony's curse feel hauntingly real on the dark seas. The Deering's fate remains unsolved, and the phantom carving of that word has cemented the incident as a Carolina Coast ghost story. In each of these cases, the mysterious appearance of Croatoan is likely coincidental or a later fabrication, rather than a sign of any real curse. Historians and skeptics note that there is no solid evidence tying these events together. Stories of Poe's last words, Earnhardt's journal, and the Deering's carved mask all come from lore rather than documented fact. It's very possible that writers and storytellers added the Croatoan detail after the fact, inspired by the Lost Colony, to dramatize these disappearances. Indeed, several other vanishings have been linked to the word in folklore. For example, stagecoach outlaw Black Bart supposedly scratched Croatoan on his jail cell wall before he disappeared from history. In horror, Arthur Ambrose Bierce allegedly had Croatoan carved into the post of the bed he slept before he vanished in Mexico. Such tales are almost certainly apocryphal. Yet, despite the dubious origins of these anecdotes, they undeniably cast a lasting spell on the imagination. Over time, people have associated Croatoan with a whole chain of mysterious vanishings, linking desperate legends into one intricate and terrifying pattern. The word itself has become a shorthand for an ominous omen, a kind of talisman of doom in American lore. While serious historians dismiss the idea of a Croatoan curse as folklore and coincidence, the recurring motif of the word reappearing wherever people disappear gives the Roanoke story a spine-tingling afterlife. It's as if the ghost of Croatoan continues to whisper through the ages, surfacing in unexpected places, just long enough to send a shiver down our spines. In the end, these creepy connections are more storytelling than history, but they enrich the legend of Roanoke, adding one more eerie chapter to the saga of the Lost Colony and its haunting legacy. Local native legend of the time also had its spookiness. The Croatoan people themselves had a lore about an evil spirit on their island, a reptilian monster of the woods that could bewitch or possess people, according to a tale recorded later by Europeans. Some imaginative writers have speculated. Could the colonists have fallen victim to a legendary creature, or turned into tree spirits, or vanished into the wilderness under a curse? These are more the domain of fantasy and horror fiction. You might encounter such ideas in TV shows like American Horror Story Roanoke or various novels. One myth claims the colony disappeared due to witches or a blood curse that turned them into the trees of the forest. Thus, no bodies were found. There's no evidence of any of this, of course. Just the human tendency to explain mysteries with the supernatural when mundane answers aren't obvious. In our safe, cozy telling, let's simply note that Roanoke has inspired ghost stories. Some people camping near Roanoke Island have claimed to hear strange calls at night or see ghostly figures, perhaps the spirits of the colonists still wandering looking for rescue. On Hatteras Island, locals long ago whispered that you could sometimes see blue-eyed children among the native families, and they believed these were the spirits or descendants of the lost colony. Such stories aren't factual, but they contribute to the atmosphere that Roanoke is not just a historical puzzle, but also a kind of haunting legend that has lingered in the collective consciousness. We have journeyed far tonight, through factual records and whispered rumors, through scholarly research and flights of fancy, all centered on this quiet coastal mystery. The Lost Colony of Roanoke remains, after more than 4 centuries, an unsolved riddle. What we do know is that these were real people, men like Ananias Dare, women like Eleanor Dare, Little children like Virginia Dare and many others who bravely sought a new life in an unknown land. They struggled, they hoped, they made do as best they could in circumstances we can only imagine with sympathy. And then they took fate into their own hands and left behind one simple word as a clue. Perhaps the beauty of the Roanoke story is that it never had a clear ending. This has allowed each generation to revisit it, investigate it with new tools like archaeology and DNA testing, and tell and retell it in their own way. In the mystery lies a gentle reminder: the past does not give up all its secret easily, and that's okay. It gives us room to wonder and dream. Let's recap ever so softly what seems most plausible given all we've explored. It seems likely that the colonists did not die at Roanoke Island itself. They moved on in search of better survival prospects. The welcoming Croatoan island may have been a first stop, and indeed they might have lived there for a while among Mantio's kin. Over the next years, they likely dispersed into the mainland, some joining friendly tribes like the Chowanoke or Wetmiok, maybe some attempting to reach the Chesapeake. They adapted to native life, perhaps wearing buckskin clothing, learning the Algonquin tongue, and teaching their children both heritages. Their English goods became heirloom or trade items. Their surnames faded as they took on Algonquin names. In time, any conflicts in the region, for instance, when Powhatan expansion brought violence, could have further reduced their numbers. But it is entirely possible that bloodlines from the Roanoke colonists persisted, hidden in plain sight among native communities. As John Lawson heard, some Heritage people around 1700 could trace a part of their lineage back to those colonists. If that's true, then the lost colony wasn't lost at all. It was absorbed into another, older culture and lived on quietly. Modern efforts continue to try to prove this. DNA projects are attempting to see if any families in the coastal Carolina have genetic markers linking to 16th century English. So far, that's very challenging and inconclusive, but maybe one day science will draw a line for us. Archaeology, too, is ongoing. Each summer, teams dig at new sites, like Site Y found in 2015 near another village site with more pottery shards. As of the latest findings, we have tantalizing pieces but no smoking gun. That's okay, because in a way, Roanoke's mystery has become more valuable than any single answer. It invites us to contemplate, to engage with history actively. We might choose to believe the most heartening scenario, that the colonists found friendship and relative peace melding into the native societies. Their story, one of cultural exchange rather than demise. That in the great scheme of things, they did survive, just not as an isolated English village, instead as guests who became family within another nation. As you lay here, drifting to sleep, imagine for a moment a calm night on Hatteras Island in, say, 1591. A Croatoan elder tends a small fire under the stars. Around him gather a few Englishmen and women, looking much leaner than when they arrived, but alive and grateful. Children with mixed heritage, some with brown eyes, some with startling gray-blue eyes, chase each other nearby, laughing in a blend of languages. Perhaps one of them is little Virginia Dare, toddling in the sand, watched over by Manteo and Eleanor Dare together. The elder sings a low chant to teach them about this island spirit, and one of the Englishmen picks up a familiar tune and softly hums a harmony, a lullaby from faraway England. In that gentle chorus, old world and new world join for a moment. The ocean breeze carries the flame sparks up to join the stars, and all is well for that night. History is seldom so poetic, but it's a nice image to ease into our dreams. The reality, whatever it was, involved hardship and endurance. Thank you for joining me on this long, meandering journey through the story of Roanoke. I hope the cozy mystery and the soft crash of historical waves have lulled you towards rest. The past has many unanswered questions, but for now we can let them be and surrender to the quiet of the night. May your dreams be peaceful and filled with wonder, and may the lost colonists sleep softly somewhere in the sands of time.